The year was 1908, and the land outside Sweetwater, Wyoming had frozen hard overnight. Dirt cracked like old leather beneath a gray sky, and a bitter wind scraped over the hills without care for man or beast. February had no mercy left. Col Callahan rode with his collar up and his hat pulled low. The wind cut through his coat just the same. His gelding Rufus moved slow through the crusted snow ears, flicking with each gust. Col hadn't spoken aloud in hours. Didn't need to. The land answered nothing back. The barn came into view behind a sagging fence and a stand of wind-stripped cottonwoods. The wood was gray with age, the roof a patchwork of rusted tin and hope. He hadn't meant to stop here. Was only passing through on his way back to the ranch after hauling feed into town. But something gnawed at the edge of his thoughts. Something off. He swung down and led Rufus into the barn's shadow boots, crunching frost. The horses should have been long gone. This place had been abandoned since old Deck Wilkins drank himself to death last fall. But inside, Col saw the imprint of something human. A wool coat hung on a nail, straw freshly turned. A rustling in the far corner. He moved, slow voice low. "It's all right. I ain't here to hurt nobody." A shape stirred, then another. A child's face peeked out from under a blanket that had seen better years. A girl, maybe 8. Then a boy younger, eyes too big for their thin faces. And behind them a woman. Her dark hair was tangled and her cheeks wine-burned, lips cracked. She didn't move, just stared at him, jaw tight, like she'd been holding her breath for too long. Col took off his hat. "Ma'am." Still she said nothing, just pulled the children closer. He knelt, the cold biting through his jeans. "Y'all ain't safe here. Cold like this, it'll take you by morning." Her eyes flinched at that. The boy coughed sharp and wet. The girl pressed her hand to his back, rubbed in small circles. Col stood. He could have turned away. Should maybe. But there was something in the woman's stillness, something stubborn and aching that felt too familiar. Like looking at a scar you forgot you had. "I've got room in my wagon. A stove back at the house. Ain't much, but it's warm." The woman finally spoke. "We don't want your charity." Her voice was hoarse, rough like gravel. She said it not out of pride, but out of weariness. Like she'd asked too many people for too many things and gotten spit for it. Col nodded once. "It ain't charity. It's just decency." The silence stretched between them. Then the girl whispered something in the woman's ear. A name, maybe. A plea. The woman's shoulders slumped. She nodded. Col didn't smile. Just backed out, gave them space. Hitched the team while they gathered what little they had. When they climbed up beside him, the boy coughed again and leaned into his sister's lap. The woman held her chin high, but her hands trembled in her lap. The wind kicked up dust behind them as they rolled east toward the ranch. Not one of them spoke, but in the quiet something shifted. The road home was rutted and mean-lined with scrub brush and broken fence posts. The wagon creaked beneath the weight of silence. Col kept one hand loose on the reins, the other on his thigh, fingers tapping a rhythm only he understood. The woman hadn't given her name. She stared out across the plain like it owed her something, eyes narrowed against the cold. The children had fallen asleep. The girl cradled the boy's head, her face calm in that stubborn way kids get when they've seen too much too young. At the ranch, Col showed them to the bunkhouse. It was dry, drafty, but better than the barn. He lit the stove and left a pot of beans warming. The woman barely looked at him as he stepped out into the dark. Later that night he sat alone in the main house. The fire popped behind him, throwing shadows across the floorboards. A tin mug of coffee went cold in his hand. He stared at the crack running through the far wall, remembering a night 10 years past when a different woman had stood on that porch, her eyes red and her bag packed. She'd told him she couldn't stand the silence anymore, couldn't sleep in a house that didn't echo with laughter. Carl had watched her go without saying much. He never did know the right words to say. His father had been the same way, quiet, clenched, hardened by years of pushing against an unforgiving land. Never talked much, just drank and worked and expected everyone else to hold steady. Carl had done what was expected. Ran cattle, mended fence, paid what debts he owed. But somewhere along the way the years had slipped past him like wind through a busted window. Too many winters alone. Too many springs spent watching life bloom in someone else's field. Back in the bunkhouse, the woman watched over her children. Her mind drifted unwilling. Her name was Miriam. She had not spoken it aloud in weeks. It felt too heavy on her tongue, like it belonged to someone else now. She had left Wichita when her husband died, or at least when his kindness did. The sickness that took hold of him after the war didn't leave bruises you could see, but it hollowed out the man she once knew. He drank and shouted and begged forgiveness in the same breath. By the time she gathered the children and walked away, she had nothing left but a train ticket and a will to keep breathing. The train broke down near Cheyenne. She'd walked the rest of the way, begging rides where she could, sleeping in stables and empty churches. Always moving, always watching. The barn had been a mistake. Too cold, too exposed. She knew it, but her son had been coughing and the girl was limping and her legs just gave out. Now here they were in the warmth of a stranger's bunkhouse, and still she didn't trust it. Nothing given came free. That was a lesson hard learned, but the children needed rest, and Carl Callahan, with his weathered hands and quiet way of speaking, didn't look like a man with a price in mind. Still, she didn't sleep that night. She sat by the stove until the embers dimmed, listening to the wind whistle outside, wondering where the next storm would find them. Ride on with us. Subscribe for the next hard truth. Morning broke soft and gray, with snow clinging to the tops of fence rails like breath held too long. Carl had already been out in it for an hour, clearing the pump and checking on the yearlings. The cold bit at his knuckles through his gloves, but it kept his thoughts from wandering too far. He found Miriam near the barn, her shoulders hunched in a borrowed coat boots that didn't quite fit. She was hauling water in a rusted bucket, her arms trembling just enough to notice. "You don't have to do that," he said, voice quiet. She didn't turn. "I'm not one for sitting around." He nodded, stepped forward and took the bucket from her without asking, walked it to the trough and dumped it in. The pump squeaked behind him as she drew another round. They worked like that for a while. No talk, just movement. Breath showing in the air between them. The kind of silence that wasn't heavy, just there. Later, Carl brought a hammer and some boards out to the bunkhouse. The front step had been half rotted since fall. He didn't say a word about it, just knelt down and got to work. Miriam stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "You always fix things that don't ask to be fixed." He looked up at her, sunlight in his eyes. "Only when someone might trip over 'em." She didn't smile, but her jaw eased a little. That evening the children joined him in the barn. The boy Luke found a fascination in the calf pens, small hands, pressed to the wood, eyes wide. The girl Annie asked questions, hundreds of them, about horses, about windmills, about how long he'd lived out here on his own. He answered what he could, leaning against a post, the smell of hay and saddle soap grounding him. It had been a long time since a voice had echoed in that barn. Miriam stood just outside, watching. She didn't interrupt, didn't tell the kids to hush or stay close. She just listened. Watched how Carl's face shifted when he spoke, how his shoulders moved, less like a man bracing against the world and more like someone remembering how to breathe. That night Carl brought stew over in a tin pot. He didn't stay, just handed it to her and nodded, saying, "There's cornbread too. I ain't much of a cook, but it'll fill you." Miriam looked at the pot, then at him. "Why are you doing this?" He paused. "Because you're here." Then he walked off, boots crunching in the snow, shoulders squared, not from pride but from habit. Inside, Miriam stirred the stew slowly. It smelled like thyme and salt and something that reminded her of Sundays long gone. The kids dug in with the kind of hunger you don't speak about. She watched them for a long while before she took a bite herself. Out the small window, the lantern from Cal's porch flickered. For the first time in months, she let herself believe that maybe not yet, but maybe this place wouldn't turn her out. The thaw came slow that year. March crept in under a blanket of gray skies and brittle mornings. Snow melted in patches, leaving behind mud and the smell of old earth waking up. Call brought out a second shovel one day without saying much, handed it to Miriam, and the two of them worked side by side, clearing the path between the barn and the main house. It wasn't asked of her. She just picked it up like it was natural. That's how most of it went. He taught her how to split fence posts without cracking them, how to twist baling wire with stiff gloves on. She showed him how to mend a torn shirt with even stitches and how to coax Luke into sleep when his cough stirred him late. She never asked for more than she gave. At night, when the children were asleep, Miriam would sit on the porch step, arms around her knees, eyes scanning the dark. Call joined her, sometimes sipping weak coffee and listening to the coyotes far off in the draw. "You always been alone out here?" she asked once, without looking at him. He thought on it. "Not always." She didn't press, just nodded like she understood. He told her later, weeks later, that his folks had died the year he turned 21. A wagon accident on the river road. He'd come back from Cheyenne to bury them. Never left again. "Guess I kept waiting for someone to need this place," he said. She looked at the house, the barn, the hill that caught the morning sun just right. Seems like it was waiting too. He wasn't a man to smile much. But something shifted in his face just then. She opened up in pieces the way a frostbitten hand comes back to life. Slow, aching. She told him about Wichita, about the winter her husband didn't come home sober, and the bruises that showed up where no one could see. About the priest who gave her a train ticket and pressed her hand so hard it left an imprint. "It ain't strength," she said one night, "leaving like that. It's just survival." "Same thing sometimes," Cal said, his voice low. She watched him with a different look after that. Not pity. Something quieter. Like she'd been measuring his silence all along and finally understood the weight behind it. He showed her the corral he'd been meaning to rebuild. Let her mark where the posts would go. Luke followed him around like a shadow now, asking about cows and how to rope things. Annie helped in the kitchen, stirring batter and setting the table without being asked. It wasn't sudden. There were still days when Miriam flinched at slamming doors, when Call left food outside instead of knocking, when the children cried in their sleep. But there were more good days now. Warm ones. Days with biscuits and stories, with fence rails lined up straight and firewood stacked high. The nights didn't feel so long. And Call, he found himself reaching for a second plate without thinking, setting down a cup of coffee in front of her without asking how she liked it, watching her eyes when she laughed, rare as it was, and feeling something shift in his chest. He wasn't sure what to call it yet, but he knew enough not to scare it off. The first sign of trouble came by way of a letter. Cal found it folded in his coat pocket, handed off at the general store in town. Addressed to, Walters, in neat, unfamiliar script. He handed it to Miriam that evening without a word, but something in his chest pulled tight as she took it. She read it by the bunkhouse stove, her mouth set in a straight line. Annie played with buttons in the corner. Luke slept. Call waited outside, hands deep in his coat pockets, watching the dark thicken. When Miriam stepped onto the porch, the letter hung from her hand like a weight. "It's from my sister," she said. Call didn't answer. "She's in Nebraska. Says she's got a room ready for us. Says the kids can start school, that there's work at a laundry in town. She's always been the practical one." He studied her face in the dim light. "You thinking of going?" She looked out toward the pasture. Snow clung to the last of the fence rails. The corral they'd rebuilt stood clean and strong. "I don't know," she said. "It's safe, familiar, but she wasn't there when I needed her." Cal's voice was quiet. "Still, it's a chance." Miriam didn't answer, just folded the letter and pressed it into her coat pocket. In the days that followed, a distance grew between them. Miriam moved like she had before, cautious, self-contained. She spoke less. Cal didn't push. He knew the look of someone already packing inside their head. The children noticed. Annie stopped asking questions. Luke kept close to his sister. Cal found himself fixing things that didn't need fixing just to keep his hands busy. Then one morning the sister arrived. Her wagon pulled up in a flurry of dust, and she stepped out dressed in city grays, her hair pinned high and stiff. Her name was Margaret. She barely looked at Cal before making for the bunkhouse. Miriam stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron. They talked in hushed tones. Margaret gestured toward the children, toward the hills, the road. Miriam's shoulders drew tighter the longer it went on. Later, Cal found Miriam behind the barn, her face turned to the wind. "She says I'm being foolish," she said, "that I've put my children in danger trusting a man I barely know." Cal stood still. She might not be wrong. Miriam looked at him then. "Are you—" He didn't speak. "I've built something here, Cal. I didn't mean to, but I did. And now I'm being told it's a dream, and dreams aren't safe." He stepped closer. "No, they ain't. But neither is going back to a world that never gave a damn about you." She turned her face away, eyes bright. That night they didn't speak. Margaret packed her wagon, sharp movements, loud sighs. The children sat quietly, sensing the weight of the grown-up silence. The next morning Miriam loaded their things into the wagon. Margaret waited, arms crossed. Cal didn't stop them. He just stood on the porch, hands balled in his sleeves, and watched the sun rise slow behind the hills. Watched the dust trail vanish down the road. Watched the porch steps sit empty again. He didn't go inside for a long time. 3 days passed. The ranch fell quiet again like it had before. The bunkhouse sat still, stove-cold dishes untouched. Cal moved through the motions, feeding the cattle, fixing the pump, riding the east line alone. But there was a hollowness to it now, the kind that echoed. He caught himself waiting for Annie's voice or for Luke's small boots thumping across the porch, for Miriam to appear with her sleeves rolled and her eyes sharp from windburn. But there was only wind and dust and the whisper of something unfinished. Then, on the 4th evening, a rider came tearing up the road, young, breathless, and not from around here. He pulled up, short-handed Cal a note, and wheeled around before any questions could be asked. It was from Miriam, scrawled fast, crooked lines. "Come if you can. She's taking the children. I can't stop her." That was all. Cal didn't saddle Rufus with care. He moved, fast hands shaking with a heat he hadn't felt in years. Not anger. Something sharper. Something that told him if he didn't go now, he'd regret it longer than he'd live. The ride to the town where Margaret had set up was hard and fast, the wind biting, dusk closing in. He found the house easy enough, big, clean, respectable. A place that looked proper and felt wrong. Miriam met him at the side door, her eyes wild with frustration and fear. "She's saying I'm unfit," she whispered, "that I've damaged them. She brought a man from the courthouse. Says she can petition for custody. Says I'm unstable." Cal's jaw clenched. "Where are the kids?" "Inside. She won't let me speak to them alone." He didn't ask permission. He stepped into that fine house with his hat still on, boots leaving mud on the rug. Margaret turned from the stove, lips tightening. Beside her stood a man in a stiff coat and polished shoes. "You can't barge in here," Margaret started. "I'll say my piece," Cal interrupted, voice flat. "Then you can tell me what you think is best." The man looked at him like he was cattle. "And who are you?" Cal looked to Miriam, then back. "I'm the man who took them in when no one else would, who kept 'em warm, fed 'em, and gave 'em space to sleep without fear." He turned to Margaret. "You want to talk about stability? That woman worked every day since she got to my ranch. She did more with nothing than most folks do with plenty. She didn't ask for help, she earned it." Margaret looked away, jaw tight. "She left because she thought it was best," Call said. "But it wasn't. You're not the one who rocked that boy to sleep when his lungs burned. You're not the one who taught that girl how to measure flour by feel. She did that. Not you." The room was quiet, thick with held breath. Then Annie's voice cut through it, soft but steady. "I want to go home." Luke stepped out behind her, holding her hand. He didn't say a word, just looked at Miriam and nodded once. The man in the coat cleared his throat. "Children don't decide these things." But Margaret's voice broke in. "Let them go." Everyone turned to her. "They're not mine," she said, looking at Miriam. I thought I was saving you." "You weren't," Miriam said, calm but firm. "I saved myself. And I'm not going back to hiding." They left that night. No arguments. No lawmen. Just Cale, Miriam, and the children riding home in the same wagon they'd once come in. Only this time no one looked back. Spring came early that year. The cottonwoods along the creek budded soft and green, and the air smelled of wet earth and the promise of things trying again. Cal had patched the roof of the bunkhouse, not because it needed it, but because he wanted it right. Miriam laughed when she saw the new curtains in the windows. She didn't say thank you. She just stood there a long while, her hand on the doorframe, then went in like it was already hers. The days settled into rhythm. Annie carried water without spilling. Luke gathered kindling with his mouth tight like he was on a mission. Call taught him to fish in the creek behind the pasture, and the boy hardly spoke but didn't leave his side. Miriam took over the garden. Said it was time to grow something on purpose. She wrote to no one. The letters that came she burned. Her past no longer needed explaining. One evening, as the sun sank red behind the ridge, Call came in from the barn to find her in the kitchen, flour on her wrists, hair falling from its tie. She looked up when he stepped in, and something passed between them. No rush, no need for speech. Just that shared knowledge that, whatever came next, they would walk into it side by side. Later that night they sat on the porch as the stars came out, the children asleep, the land quiet. Cal reached into his coat and pulled out something small wrapped in cloth. He held it out. Miriam unwrapped it slow. Inside was a simple silver band, smoothed from age, worn but whole. "It was my mother's," Call said. "Been sittin' in a drawer too long." She looked at it, then at him. No tears. Just a soft breath, like she'd been holding it for years. "I don't need anything fancy," he added. "Just need to know you'll stay." "I already am," she said. They married under the cottonwoods the next Sunday. Annie picked wildflowers for the table. Luke stood tall in a shirt too big. No preacher, just words spoken with hands clasped and eyes honest. That summer Miriam hung laundry in the wind and planted sunflowers along the fence. Call built a swing in the elm tree for the kids. The ranch began to look different, not new, but lived in, loved. One morning, as they stood at the edge of the field, Miriam placed his hand gently over her stomach. Nothing said, just a look that carried everything. New roots had taken hold. And as the wind moved through the grass, warm and steady, Call understood he had not saved her. She had not saved him. But together they had made something worth holding on to. Something that would last. Subscribe and see what survives the long night.